I'm Emma Carter, and if you've ever felt like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, well, let me tell you, I know what that feels like. Every morning, I wake up at 5:30 a.m., gulp down a cup of coffee that tastes like burnt regrets, and head to work as a nurse at Chicago General Hospital. My life is a blur of 12-hour shifts, patient charts, and trying not to cry in the supply closet when things get overwhelming. But it's not just my job, it's everything else too. Ever since Mom and Dad died in that car accident when I was 16, I've been the glue holding our family together. And by our family, I mostly mean Lila, my younger sister. Lila is complicated. She's 24 now, finishing her business degree at Northwestern University, which, by the way, I paid for. Yeah, you heard me right. I worked 2 jobs during high school, so she could have a normal teenage life. While she was out partying with her sorority sisters or whatever they do these days, I was working double shifts at a diner and studying late into the night. I don't say this to sound like a martyr. I did it because I love her. Or at least I thought I did. These days, though, I'm starting to wonder if all my sacrifices were worth it. We live together in a small apartment downtown, not because we want to, but because neither of us can afford much else. Our place smells faintly of takeout boxes and laundry detergent, and there's always some kind of mess Lila leaves behind. Clothes strewn across the couch, empty Starbucks cups on the counter, and God forbid she ever clean up after herself. Sometimes I think about moving out, getting my own space where I can breathe without feeling suffocated by her carelessness. But then guilt creeps in, whispering reminders of how much she still needs me, or so I tell myself. Let me take you back to when everything changed. It was a rainy Friday evening, and I was supposed to go to a football game with my friends. Instead, I ended up sitting in a sterile hospital waiting room, staring at the floor while nurses whispered condolences to each other. The police said it was a drunk driver who hit them head-on. Just like that, my parents were gone, and I became an orphan teenager thrust into adulthood overnight. I remember holding Lila's hand as she sobbed uncontrollably. She was only 9 years old, and suddenly, I wasn't just her big sister anymore. I was her guardian. That year was brutal. I dropped out of extracurriculars, picked up babysitting gigs, and learned how to cook meals on a shoestring budget. We had to move out of our suburban home because we couldn't afford the mortgage, cramming ourselves into a tiny rental apartment instead. Dad had left behind a modest inheritance fund, a safety net meant for both of us once we turned 18, but most of it went toward keeping the lights on and putting food on the table. By the time I graduated high school, there wasn't much left. Still, I promised myself I'd make sure Lila had opportunities. One never did. So I took out loans to pay for my nursing degree while covering Lila's tuition too. Looking back now, I realize how unfair it was to shoulder all that responsibility alone. But at the time, it felt like the only choice. I told myself that one day, when we were both grown up and successful, it would all be worth it. That dream kept me going through sleepless nights and endless sacrifices. Little did I know, dreams can shatter faster than glass. Fast forward to today, and here we are, 2 adult women sharing a cramped apartment, barely speaking except when absolutely necessary. Lila's final semester at Northwestern is almost over, and honestly, I should be proud of her. She's smart, ambitious, and has this magnetic charm that makes people gravitate toward her. But lately, she's been acting entitled, like everything I've done for her is somehow owed to her. Like the other night, when she came home late reeking of champagne and casually announced she quit her part-time internship because it was beneath her. Beneath her. Do you know how many hours I've spent scrubbing bedpans just to keep her enrolled in that fancy university? It doesn't help that she constantly brushes off my efforts. Last week, I reminded her about paying her share of the rent, and she rolled her eyes, saying, "Relax, Emma. You'll get your money once I land my dream job." Dream job? What about mine? Does she even realize how hard I work to keep us afloat? Sometimes I feel invisible, like no matter what I do, it's never enough. And maybe that's why I snap sometimes, yelling at her to pick up her dirty clothes or stop leaving dishes in the sink. It's not really about the mess, it's about respect. Respect that she rarely shows me. Even worse, she acts like she's the victim in all of this. A few days ago, She accused me of being jealous of her success. Jealous? Of course, I want her to succeed. I've dedicated half my life to making sure she does. But success isn't entitlement. Success means gratitude, humility, and recognizing the people who helped you along the way. As I sit here typing this, tears pricking my eyes, I can't help but wonder if Lila will ever understand that, or if she even cares. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, plain and unassuming, addressed to both Lila and me. Inside was a letter from Mr. Thompson, the lawyer who handled our parents' estate. He informed us that the remaining inheritance, a trust fund worth $500,000, was finally ready to be distributed now that Lila was nearing graduation. Half of it belonged to her and half to me. Relief washed over me as I read the details. Finally, some financial stability. Finally, a chance to catch my breath after years of scraping by. But something felt off. When I showed Lila the letter, she barely glanced at it before shrugging and saying, "Cool, I guess. Cool." This was life-changing news, and she acted like it was nothing more than a coupon for free coffee. Her indifference gnawed at me, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just distracted. After all, finals week was approaching, and she'd been stressed about her thesis project. Still, a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered warnings I couldn't ignore. Later that night, I logged onto the bank account linked to the trust fund to check its status. That's when I saw it, the withdrawal notice. A lump sum of $500,000 transferred to an unfamiliar account last month. My heart sank as realization dawned. Someone had stolen the entire inheritance. And based on the timing and the signature on the transfer form, I knew exactly who it was. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the transaction history. There it was, in black and white, every last penny of our inheritance gone. The signature on the withdrawal form was mine, or at least, a very convincing forgery. My stomach churned as anger bubbled up inside me, hot and acidic. How could she do this? How could Lila betray me like this after everything I've done for her? I marched into the living room where Lila was lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone with that same carefree expression she always wore. "Lila," I said, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. She looked up, startled by the tone. "What did you do with the inheritance?" Her eyes widened for a split second before she masked her reaction with feigned confusion. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but her voice wavered slightly, giving her away. I held up my phone, showing her the bank statement. "This," I snapped. "You forged my signature and took all the money. Don't even try to deny it." For a moment, she just sat there, frozen. Then, slowly, her lips curled into a smirk, and she leaned back against the couch cushions like she didn't have a care in the world. "Oh, come on, Emma," she said, rolling her eyes. "Don't act so dramatic. It's not like you were using that money anyway." My jaw dropped. Was she serious right now? Not using it? I echoed, incredulous. "Are you kidding me? That money was supposed to help us both. You had no right to take it." But Lila just shrugged, unfazed. "Well, maybe if you'd been less controlling and let me handle things my way, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Lila's nonchalant attitude only fueled my rage. "Controlling?" I shot back, my voice rising. "I worked my ass off to keep us afloat while you pranced around college like some spoiled princess. And now you're accusing me of being controlling because I expect basic decency from you." She flinched at my words but quickly recovered, standing up to face me. "Decency," she spat. "You think working hard gives you the moral high ground? Newsflash, Emma, I'm the one who's going places. I need resources to build my future, and frankly, you've already gotten more than your fair share of Dad's estate." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. More than my fair share? Did she really believe that? More than my fair share? I repeated, my voice shaking. "Do you even hear yourself? I used most of that money to put food on the table and send you to school. Without me, you wouldn't even have graduated high school, let alone Northwestern." Lila crossed her arms, glaring at me. "Yeah, well, maybe I'd have figured it out on my own if you hadn't smothered me my whole life. You act like you're some kind of saint, but you're just jealous because I'm finally stepping out of your shadow." Jealous. Again with the jealousy card. I wanted to scream, to shake her until she understood how ridiculous she sounded. But instead, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Yelling wasn't going to solve anything. "Lila," I said, my voice low and steady, "you can spin this however you want, but stealing is stealing. That money belongs to both of us, and what you did was wrong. If you don't give it back, I'll have no choice but to take legal action." For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. But it vanished almost instantly, replaced by defiance. "Go ahead," she challenged. "See if I care." That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lila's smug face, heard her dismissive words echoing in my mind. I felt sick, not just because of what she'd done, but because of what it said about our relationship. Had she always seen me as someone to exploit? Someone whose sacrifices meant nothing to her? The thought made me feel hollow, like all those years of putting her needs above my own had been wasted. The next morning, I called in sick to work and went straight to see Mr. Thompson, the lawyer. He listened patiently as I explained everything. The forged documents, the stolen funds, Lila's refusal to acknowledge what she'd done. When I finished, he sighed heavily, looking at me with a mix of sympathy and professionalism. "Emma," he said, "this isn't going to be easy. Family disputes are messy, especially when money is involved. But legally, you're entitled to half of that inheritance, and I'll do everything I can to help you get it back." His reassurance gave me a small sense of relief, but I knew the road ahead would be long and painful. Later that day, I hired a private investigator recommended by a coworker. His name was Marcus, a gruff but kind-hearted guy who promised to dig deep into Lila's financial activities. As I handed over copies of the forged documents and bank statements, I felt a surge of determination. No matter how much it hurt, I wasn't going to let Lila get away with this. Not this time. This wasn't just about the money, it was about justice. About reclaiming the respect and dignity she trampled on. A week later, Marcus called me with an update. I met him at a quiet coffee shop near the hospital, clutching my latte like it was a lifeline. "So," he began, pulling out a folder stuffed with papers. "Your sister's been busy." He slid a document across the table, pointing to a series of transactions. She transferred chunks of the inheritance to different accounts, likely to cover her tracks. Most of it went toward personal expenses, designer clothes, spa treatments, vacations. Oh, and this one caught my eye. He tapped a line item labeled condo down payment. My heart sank. A condo. She bought herself a condo with our inheritance. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. All those nights I spent worrying about bills, skipping meals to save money, sacrificing my own happiness for hers, and here she was, living it up like some Instagram influencer. "There's more," Marcus added, his tone grave. "She also made several large cash withdrawals. Whatever she's hiding, it's big. Big. What could possibly be bigger than stealing $500,000? As I absorbed the information, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. How had things gotten so twisted? How had the sister I loved turned into someone I barely recognized? On the walk back to my apartment, I replayed every memory I had of Lila, the good times, the bad times, the moments that made me question whether I'd ever truly known her. Maybe I'd been naive, clinging to the idea of the perfect sibling bond despite all the signs pointing to something darker. Or maybe people change when they're given too much freedom without accountability. Either way, I realized then that getting the money back wasn't going to fix everything. Some wounds ran deeper than any amount of cash could heal. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, anger, betrayal, and a crushing sense of isolation. I threw myself into work, hoping the chaos of the hospital would drown out my thoughts. But no matter how many patients I cared for or how many hours I clocked in, the weight of what Lila had done lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. Then came the rumors. It started subtly, a snide comment from one of the nurses about how money changes people. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was just idle gossip. But soon, whispers began swirling around me whenever I walked into the break room. One day, as I grabbed a cup of coffee, I overheard two colleagues talking behind my back. "Did you hear about Emma?" one said, her voice low but not low enough. "Apparently, she's suing her own sister for $500,000. Talk about family drama." My stomach churned as I realized what was happening. Somehow, word had gotten out about the lawsuit, and naturally, everyone assumed I was the villain. When I confronted Lila later that evening, She didn't deny spreading the rumors. In fact, she seemed almost proud of herself. "What did you expect, Emma?" she sneered, lounging on the couch like she owned the place. "You think I'm just going to sit here while you drag my name through the mud? If anyone deserves sympathy, it's me. You're the one who's been controlling me my entire life." Her words stung, but what hurt even more was knowing she'd manipulated the narrative to paint herself as the victim. And worse yet, people believed her. Feeling cornered and misunderstood, I decided to take a rare afternoon off and visit the park near my apartment. It wasn't much, a patch of grass surrounded by towering skyscrapers, but it was quiet, peaceful. As I sat on a bench, staring at the fountain in the center of the park, I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I let them fall, letting the weight of everything crash down on me. I felt utterly alone. That's when Daniel Harper found me. He was sitting on the opposite end of the bench, sipping coffee from a thermos. I hadn't noticed him until he spoke. "Rough day." His voice was soft, non-judgmental. I wiped my eyes quickly, embarrassed to be caught crying in public. "Just life stuff," I muttered, hoping he'd leave it at that. But instead, he offered me a small smile. "Life has a way of piling it on, doesn't it? Want to talk about it?" Something about his calm demeanor put me at ease. Over the next hour, I poured out everything: the inheritance, Lila's betrayal, the lawsuit, the rumors. To my surprise, Daniel listened without interrupting, nodding thoughtfully as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Sounds like you've been carrying a lot on your shoulders," he said. "And honestly, none of this is your fault. People will always try to twist things to fit their version of the truth. Don't let them make you doubt yourself." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I couldn't control what others thought of me, but I could control how I responded. And right now, I needed to focus on standing up for myself, not just legally, but emotionally too. As the trial date approached, Marcus called with another update. This time, his tone was grim. "Emma, we need to talk," he said over the phone. We met at the same coffee shop where he'd shown me the initial findings. He slid a folder across the table, his expression unreadable. "This isn't going to be easy to hear," he warned. My heart sank as I opened the folder and scanned the contents. Inside were emails between Lila and someone named Rachel Kim, an executive at a startup where Lila had interned during college. The subject line of one email caught my eye: expense report adjustments. Marcus explained that Lila hadn't just stolen from our inheritance, she'd also embezzled funds from the company she worked for. Apparently, she'd altered expense reports to funnel money into her personal accounts, covering her tracks with fake invoices and receipts. "It looks like she got greedy," Marcus said. "She thought she could get away with it because the company was small and disorganized. But they're on to her now, and they're considering pressing charges." I stared at the documents, my hands trembling. How far had she gone? How much damage had she caused? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of Lila's face, her smirk, her defiance, her accusations. But beneath the anger and disappointment, there was something else: sadness. Sadness for the person she'd become. Sadness for the bond we once shared. And sadness for the realization that some mistakes can't be undone. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and stale air, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions raging inside me. I sat stiffly in the front row, clutching my purse like a lifeline, as the judge entered and took his seat. Across the aisle, Lila looked impossibly composed, dressed in a sleek navy blazer that screamed borrowed confidence. She glanced at me briefly, her lips curling into a faint smirk before turning her attention to her lawyer. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't about theatrics, it was about justice. The prosecution began by presenting evidence of the forged documents and unauthorized withdrawals. Each piece of paper felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder of how thoroughly Lila had betrayed me. When it was my turn to testify, I stepped up to the stand, my legs shaking beneath me. Under oath, I recounted everything: the sacrifices I'd made, the trust I'd placed in her, and the shock of discovering what she'd done. As I spoke, I kept my gaze fixed on the judge, refusing to look at Lila. Tears threatened to spill, but I swallowed them back, determined to appear strong. Then it was Lila's turn. She rose gracefully, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached the stand. Her testimony was calculated, designed to tug at heartstrings and shift blame. "Emma's always tried to control me," she said, her voice quivering just enough to sound sincere. "She acts like she's doing everything out of love, but really, she just wants to keep me dependent on her. Taking the inheritance was my way of breaking free." The courtroom fell silent as jurors exchanged glances. For a moment, I wondered if they'd believe her lies. Then I remembered something Daniel had told me. Truth has a way of shining through, even in the darkest moments. I clung to that hope as the trial pressed on. As Lila continued her testimony, I found myself gripping the edge of my seat so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Her words were a calculated performance, each sentence crafted to paint me as the villain in our story. "Emma's always acted like she knows what's best for everyone," she said, her voice wavering slightly, as if she were on the verge of tears. "She doesn't trust me to make my own decisions. She never has." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and I could feel eyes turning toward me, judging, questioning. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to breathe steadily. This was exactly what she wanted, to rattle me, to make me lose control. But then something inside me snapped. Enough was enough. When it came time for cross-examination, Daniel stood up, his presence commanding yet calm. "Miss Carter," he began, addressing Lila with polite formality, "you claim your sister has been controlling you. Yet, according to these documents," he gestured to the evidence pile on the prosecutor's table, "you forged her signature to access funds meant for both of you. Can you explain why you felt entitled to take all $500,000 without consulting her?" Lila hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. For the first time since the trial began, her composure cracked. I needed it," she stammered. "I had plans, dreams. Emma would have just squandered it anyway." The courtroom erupted into murmurs again, but this time they weren't directed at me. Lila's selfishness was laid bare for everyone to see. Daniel pressed further, exposing inconsistencies in her story until she broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. It was painful to watch, not because I pitied her, but because it confirmed everything I'd feared. The sister I once loved was gone, replaced by someone who valued greed over family. Later that evening, as I sat alone in my apartment nursing a glass of wine, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Lila standing there, her face streaked with mascara, and her usual bravado replaced by vulnerability. "Can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, but curiosity, and maybe a shred of lingering hope, made me step aside. She walked in cautiously, perching on the edge of the couch like she expected me to explode at any moment. "I'm sorry," she whispered after a long silence. "I didn't mean for things to go this far." Her apology sounded hollow, rehearsed, but I let her continue. "Look, I know I messed up, but can we settle this out of court? I'll give you 25% of the inheritance. That's fair, right? 25%. After everything she'd taken from me, after every lie, every betrayal, she thought throwing a quarter of the stolen money back at me would fix things? My blood boiled, but instead of yelling, I laughed, a cold, bitter laugh that made her flinch. "You really don't get it, do you?" I said, shaking my head. "This isn't about the money anymore, Lila. It's about accountability, about owning up to what you've done. And no amount of cash is going to change that." Her face hardened, the brief glimpse of remorse vanishing instantly. "Fine," she spat, standing abruptly. "Have it your way. But don't expect me to forgive you when this ruins my life." With that, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. As the sound echoed through the empty apartment, I sank onto the couch, exhausted but resolute. She could keep trying to twist the narrative all she wanted, but I wasn't backing down now. The next morning, Marcus called with news that sent chills down my spine. "We found something big," he said, his tone urgent. He met me at his office later that day, spreading photocopies of handwritten notes across his desk. They were excerpts from our father's original will, notes written in his unmistakable scrawl detailing how the inheritance should be divided equally between Lila and me upon reaching adulthood. But here's the kicker. Someone had altered the document months before our father passed away. According to the forensic analysis, the changes matched Lila's handwriting. It looks like she manipulated the will shortly before your dad died, Marcus explained, his expression grave. She must have known he was sick and decided to stack the deck in her favor early on. My hands trembled as I stared at the evidence. Not only had she stolen from me recently, she'd been planning this betrayal for years. The realization hit me like a freight train. All those times I told myself she was just reckless or immature, I'd been wrong. This wasn't impulsiveness, it was premeditation. When the altered will was presented in court the following week, the impact was immediate. The judge frowned deeply, and even Lila's lawyer seemed taken aback. Miss Carter, the judge addressed her sternly, do you have anything to say regarding these allegations? Lila looked pale, her confident facade crumbling under the weight of undeniable proof. For the first time, she couldn't spin her way out of trouble. And as the truth hung heavy in the air, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. Justice was within reach, but at what cost? The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the jury filed back in after hours of deliberation. Every second felt like an eternity, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension in the room. I sat stiffly, my fingers interlaced so tightly they ached. Across the aisle, Lila slumped in her chair, her blazer wrinkled and her makeup smudged. She avoided looking at anyone, staring at the floor as though willing herself to disappear. Finally, the foreman stood, clearing his throat before reading the verdict. In the matter of Emma Carter versus Lila Carter, the jury finds in favor of the plaintiff. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by disbelief. We'd won. The judge ordered Lila to return the stolen inheritance plus interest, along with penalties for forgery and embezzlement. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, I exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of months of stress begin to lift. Yet, as I glanced at Lila's defeated figure being led away by her lawyer, I couldn't muster the satisfaction I thought I'd feel. Instead, there was only emptiness, a void where our relationship used to be. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us, shouting questions about family betrayal and sibling rivalry. I ignored them, walking briskly toward Daniel, who waited patiently near the steps. "You did it," he said, offering a small smile. Justice prevailed. I nodded, but the victory felt bittersweet. Winning the lawsuit didn't erase the pain of losing my sister, or the innocence I once held about family bonds. As we drove away from the chaos, I realized that while the legal battle was over, the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. That night, I returned to an empty apartment for the first time in years. Lila had moved out weeks earlier, leaving behind only a note taped to the fridge. "You got what you wanted. Happy now." The words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed how little she understood. This had never been about winning or revenge. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine and holding her accountable for her actions. Still, seeing the place stripped of her belongings felt surreal, like stepping into a ghost town of memories. I spent the evening sorting through old photo albums, flipping through pictures of happier times. There we were, two little girls building sandcastles at the beach, laughing as waves crashed around us. Another snapshot showed us baking cookies with Mom, flour dusting our cheeks like freckles. Those moments felt so distant now, almost like they belonged to someone else's life. At some point, tears blurred my vision, and I closed the album, unable to look anymore. Grief washed over me, not for the loss of the inheritance, but for the loss of a sister I thought I knew. But amidst the sadness, there was clarity. For years, I defined myself through my sacrifices for Lila, believing that loving her meant giving endlessly without expecting anything in return. Now, I understood that love also required boundaries and self-respect. Sitting alone in the quiet apartment, I made a promise to myself. Moving forward, I would prioritize my own happiness. No more living in the shadows of others' expectations. No more letting guilt dictate my choices. For the first time in years, I felt free. The days following the trial were a strange blend of relief and uncertainty. With the legal battle behind me, I finally had the space to breathe, but that didn't mean life suddenly became easy. The inheritance money sat untouched in my bank account, a reminder of everything I'd fought for. Yet, instead of feeling triumphant, I found myself paralyzed by indecision. What was I supposed to do with it? Splurge on luxuries I'd never allowed myself? Invest in something practical? Or maybe give part of it away. The weight of possibility felt overwhelming. I started small, tackling the practicalities first. I paid off my student loans, which had loomed over me like a dark cloud since graduation. Then, I cleared out our shared apartment, boxing up Lila's abandoned belongings and donating them to charity. It was cathartic in a way, like shedding layers of resentment alongside old clothes and dusty trinkets. One evening, as I scrubbed down the kitchen counters, I caught a glimpse of myself in the window reflection. For the first time in years, I looked lighter. Not happy exactly, but freer. Still, there was a void where Lila used to be. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that I didn't need her in my life, the silence of the apartment reminded me daily of what we'd lost. Sometimes, late at night, I'd scroll through old text messages or voicemails, searching for traces of a sister I once loved. But those memories only deepened the ache inside me. Moving forward wasn't going to be easy, but staying stuck in the past wasn't an option either. A few weeks later, an envelope arrived in the mail. My heart skipped a beat when I recognized Lila's handwriting on the front. Part of me wanted to throw it away unread, but curiosity won out. Inside was a handwritten letter, a rarity for Lila, who preferred emojis and voice memos. "Hey, Emma," it began, her looping cursive messy but familiar. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you tossed this letter in the trash. But I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." My hands trembled as I read on. She admitted she'd been wrong, not just about the inheritance, but about everything. About dismissing my sacrifices, about manipulating Dad's will, about treating me like an enemy instead of a sister. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote, "but I miss you. And if you're willing to meet me for coffee sometime, I'd really like to explain myself properly. No excuses, no lies, just honesty." By the time I reached the end, tears were streaming down my face. Her words weren't perfect, but they were sincere, and that alone gave me pause. For days, I debated whether to respond. Could I trust her to keep her promise of honesty? Or would meeting her just reopen old wounds? Finally, I sent a brief reply. "Okay, coffee next Saturday." As soon as I hit send, doubt crept in. Was I making a mistake? Only time would tell. In the meantime, I threw myself into volunteering at a local community center. It started as a distraction, a way to fill the emptiness left by Lila's absence, but quickly became something more meaningful. The center offered free health workshops for single parents and low-income families, and my nursing skills proved invaluable. Every Saturday morning, I taught classes on nutrition, stress management, and basic first aid, watching as participants lit up with newfound knowledge. One particular mom, a young woman named Rosa, reminded me so much of myself at her age. She juggled 2 jobs while raising 3 kids, wearing exhaustion like a second skin. After one session, she approached me hesitantly, thanking me for the advice. "You have no idea how much this means to us," she said, her voice thick with emotion. In that moment, I realized how lucky I was to have survived my own struggles, and how important it was to pay it forward. Helping others gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, Daniel and I grew closer. Our conversations shifted from casual updates about the case to deeper topics, our dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. He admired my resilience, he said, and encouraged me to dream bigger than I ever had before. Slowly, tentatively, I began to let myself imagine a life beyond survival, a life filled with joy, passion, and maybe even love. Saturday arrived sooner than I expected. I chose a quiet cafe near Millennium Park, hoping the neutral location would ease any tension. When Lila walked in, I barely recognized her. Gone was the polished facade she'd worn during the trial. Instead, she looked smaller, somehow humbler. She slid into the seat across from me, fidgeting nervously with the strap of her purse. "Thanks for coming," she said softly, avoiding my gaze. We ordered coffee and sat in awkward silence for a few minutes before she finally spoke. "I messed up, Emma. Big time. And not just with the inheritance, with everything. I've spent my whole life blaming you for things that weren't your fault, resenting you for being stronger than me. But none of that excuses what I did." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw genuine remorse in her eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, or ever really, but I want to try to make things right. Even if it takes years." Her vulnerability disarmed me. I couldn't erase the pain she'd caused, but I could see glimmers of the sister I once loved beneath the layers of mistakes. "Lila," I said gently, "forgiveness isn't something you can demand. It has to be earned. And rebuilding trust, that's going to take work. From both of us." She nodded earnestly, tears spilling onto the table. "I'll do whatever it takes," she promised. For the first time in months, I believed her. Over the next few weeks, Lila and I met regularly, always in public places, always briefly. Each conversation was tentative, like testing the ice before stepping onto it fully. She told me about her struggles since the trial, losing her internship, facing potential criminal charges for embezzlement, and grappling with guilt over betraying our father's memory. At first, I listened without offering much input, unsure how to navigate this fragile dynamic. But gradually, I began opening up too, sharing my own fears and frustrations. One afternoon, as we strolled along the Chicago Riverwalk, she stopped suddenly, turning to face me. "Emma," she said, her voice trembling, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my gratitude for everything you've done for me, even when I didn't deserve it. If you'll let me, I want to start earning back your trust. One step at a time." Her sincerity struck a chord within me. Forgiveness wasn't a switch you flipped, it was a journey. And though I still had doubts, I knew I owed it to both of us to try. That night, as I lay in bed reflecting on our progress, I realized something profound. Healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about finding a way to move forward together. We weren't the same sisters we'd been before, and maybe that was okay. Maybe we could build something stronger, more honest, out of the ashes of what we'd lost. Months passed, and slowly, life began to feel less like a storm and more like a steady breeze. Lila found a job at a small nonprofit organization, working tirelessly to rebuild her reputation. She even started attending therapy, determined to confront the insecurities and entitlement that had driven her actions. Watching her transform gave me hope, not just for her, but for us as sisters. As for me, I continued volunteering at the community center, eventually taking on a leadership role in their health initiative program. The work energized me, reminding me why I'd chosen nursing in the first place: to help people, to make a difference. Daniel remained a constant presence in my life, supporting me through every high and low. One evening, as we watched the sunset from Navy Pier, he turned to me with a smile. "You're incredible, you know that," he said. "You've been through hell and come out stronger on the other side." His words warmed my heart, filling me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. On the anniversary of our parents' passing, Lila and I visited their gravesite together. It was the first time we'd stood side by side in years, united in grief and gratitude. As we placed flowers on their headstones, I felt a wave of bittersweet nostalgia wash over me. "They'd be proud of you, you know," Lila said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Of both of us." I nodded, blinking back tears. "Yeah," I replied. "I think they would." Later that evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights twinkle like stars, I reflected on how far I'd come. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, I knew that, but for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. Hopeful for my future, for my relationship with Lila, and for the person I was becoming. Life had taught me hard lessons about betrayal, forgiveness, and self-worth, but it had also shown me the power of resilience and redemption. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I smiled to myself. This wasn't the ending I'd envisioned all those years ago when I sacrificed everything for Lila, but maybe that was the point. Life rarely follows the script we write for it. Instead, it challenges us, breaks us, and forces us to rebuild ourselves piece by piece until we emerge stronger than before. I thought about the inheritance, the money that had caused so much pain and upheaval, and realized it wasn't the most valuable thing I'd reclaimed. What truly mattered was the sense of self-worth I'd rediscovered along the way. Money could buy comfort, but it couldn't buy happiness, fulfillment, or family. Those things had to be earned and cherished. With a final glance at the glittering skyline, I whispered a silent thank you to the universe. Thank you for the struggles that shaped me, the lessons that strengthened me, and the people who stayed by my side. Most of all, thank you for giving me the courage to take back what was mine, not just financially, but emotionally and spiritually too. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I was ready to face it head on. And with that, I stepped back inside, closing the door on the past and opening a new chapter in my life.